So we're on page 235 in the Kuzari, and we were discussing this very bold claim in paragraph 67. The very bold claim is that Hebrew is superior to Arabic and to any other language. And that's not something that resonates with someone who's reading this in the 12th century in an Arabic society. As we mentioned last week, you look at an Arabic dictionary and it's huge. It's got so many different words, and the Hebrew dictionary has so very few words. So it doesn't seem to make sense to suggest that Hebrew is a superior language. And so here's the rabbi's response. And of course we talked about the historical backdrop, this whole debate about whether Hebrew poetry and prose should be imitative, whether it's appropriate for it to be imitative of the very stylized Arabic poetry and meter of the time. You see, this is, again, all part of the resistance that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is trying to express, not to be copycats. We're not supposed to try and copy the parent culture. We're supposed to try and use the unique Jewish voice, and not try to adulterate it with external cultures. We talked about our discussion before language. We talked about music, if you remember. We talked about the question: is there really such a thing as Jewish music or not? Right? And that was one issue where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said, Jewish music there is, but we just don't know. We don't know what it is because we lost it, and it was amazing. It was just so much more amazing than anything you can imagine. Like imagine the best Jewish compositions of today that have been consigned to servants and scoundrels. And Hebrew language has also diminished in its greatness because of so many of our travelings throughout the diaspora. But Hebrew is a superior language over Arabic, and therefore, once again, we should not try to assimilate other cultural mores and incorporate that in our use of the Hebrew language. So the Kuzari king, very rightfully so, has a lot of problem with this because this is really a stretch for him from a logical standpoint. And the rabbi argues that in paragraph 68, the rabbi says, Hebrew suffered the same fate as its bearers. It became impoverished with their impoverishment, and it was reduced with their reduction. But it's really the most important of all languages, both for historical and logical reasons. So historical reasons is what we're going to be focusing on today, and the next time we'll get into the logic of what the logical arguments for Hebrew's superiority. Let's first talk about the historical argument. So he says like this in the bottom of page 235. Historically, Hebrew is the language which God used when he spoke with Adam and Chava, and which Adam and Chava used to converse with each other. This can be verified. And now, of course, how do we verify this? How do we know? Prove to me that Adam and Chava spoke Hebrew. You know that old joke, how do you know that Moshe Rabbeinu wore a shtreimel? How do you know that Moshe Rabbeinu wore a shtreimel? What? Moshe Rabbeinu would go to Har Sinai without a shtreimel? That's how you know he wore a shtreimel. Right? Now that's the, So you can say, how do you know that Adam and Chava spoke Hebrew? What? What else would they speak? Yiddish, right? So that could be a good entree into a number of different jokes, but we're actually going to demonstrate that using the actual structure of the Hebrew language, we can prove that this was the spoken language at the time of creation, or at the time of creation of man and woman. And it can be verified by the etymology of their names. Adam comes from Adama. There are very few languages, other than Semitic languages. I'm not a linguist, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's argument is that there is no other language other than Hebrew, or perhaps other Semitic languages, which are cousin languages to Hebrew. and that's an important side point. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and as well as the Ibn Ezra, are of the belief that you can have families of language. Right? You can have what is the family of Semitic languages? It's really three primarily. There are other ancient languages that we don't have anymore. But the three Semitic languages that still exist to this day, anyone know what they are? Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Those are the three. And those three languages are still used in the Middle East today. Arabic for sure. That's the most widespread language in the Middle East. Hebrew in the state of Israel. And where is Aramaic used? Where is it spoken? Some Syrians still use it. Chaldeans still use it. In the Chaldean church, they use Aramaic as the prayer language. That is their official holy language for Christian Chaldeans. So it is still a spoken language in some circles. But there are different dialects, of course, of all of these different languages. Okay, but in Hebrew, and perhaps you could argue in derivations of Hebrew as well, the word Adam and man and earth are etymologically related, and that does not exist in other languages. For example, man and earth are two different words. And even Adam, which we take from the Hebrew, the word earth or soil is in no way etymologically related to the human being. And God, we know, according to the Torah, called man Adam, ki min ha'adama, right? God takes him from the Adama. So that's why he's called Adam. So you see that the Hebrew language is the language that describes the actual process of creation. Isha comes from Ish. Right? Woman comes from man. Now you could argue in English also we say man, woman, but the letters W-O don't mean anything, right? Unless, whoa, man. But I don't think that's that's the derivation. But Ish and Isha, that's the Isha is the derivative. That's what Isha, the letter Hey afterwards, is the derivative of Ish. And that, of course, is descriptive of the creation of woman. Chava comes from Chai, living. Vayikra Adam et Shem Ishto Chava, ki hi hayta ein kol chai. That Adam calls his wife Chava because she was the mother of all that is living, all living human beings. So you see that the name Chava is descriptive of how she is the matriarch she is the giver of life. Okay? Which is an interesting question, why he didn't call her Chaya. Because Chaya is a nice Jewish name also. But why her name was Chava, that's a discussion perhaps for another time. Cain comes from Kanisi. That she called, let me just look at just want to make sure I quote you the pasuk accurately. V'ha'adam yadat Chava ishto v'atar v'tilet Cain, that Adam and Chava are intimate, and she becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to Cain. Vatomer, and she said, Kaniti ish es Hashem. And she said, I have acquired a human being with God. Right? So, to acquire, if she's saying that that's the reason why I'm calling him Cain, so Cain in some way represents the term acquisition. That alliteration only works if you subscribe to the fact that they were using Hebrew at the time. Shes, who's the third son, Seth, comes from Shas. Ki shasli elokim zera acher tachas hevel ki aragokai. It comes from God has provided me a surrogate or a replacement child. That's what the word Seth implies. So that only works if you use the Hebrew language. And Noach comes from Zeyinachamenu. He will alleviate for us or comfort us by providing us some respite. So the word Noach also is a derivative, can only be used in that derivative fashion if you use the Hebrew language. There's a famous question that the commentaries ask, that if the names that we find are being given to in Tanakh are based on Hebrew meanings, which is what the Torah says, what do you do with the name Moshe? Right? Moshe, the Torah says that Bitya, who was the daughter of Paro, called him Moshe, Ki min hamayim mishisihu, because she says, I drew him from the water. Now she apparently did not speak Hebrew. That was not her spoken language. Unless you want to argue that she was some kind of like, if you want to imagine her as some kind of seminary girl growing up in Paro's house and she spoke Hebrew, that's not likely. It's very far-fetched. So she must have spoken ancient Egyptian, and yet the Torah still attributes a derivative name based on a Hebrew word to be Moshe something. So the commentaries actually grapple with this issue. I think I've mentioned this to you before in one of our classes when we talked about the name Moshe and how it's derived. But this is something that doesn't fit this argument that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes. So some actually say that she actually called him by a different name. His name only in Hebrew was Moshe, and in Egyptian it was another name which is reflective of the term being drawn from water in the Egyptian language. Others learn that it actually just happens to be a coincidence that she called his name Moshe, because Moshe refers to something else in Egyptian language, but in Hebrew, it coincidentally means drawn from water. So there's different ways to explain it. But certainly this pattern that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi offers is very compelling, that names that are given in the Bible are names that are based on Hebrew, the usage of Hebrew as a living language. And therefore, if you go back all the way to the beginning of the Torah and you see what the spoken language was at the time of creation, you see that it was Hebrew. And therefore, Hebrew was the spoken language by the entire world before the Tower of Babel, before Migdal Bavel. Right? So, when the Torah says, "Vayhi chol haaretz safa echad udvarim achadim," that the whole world spoke one language, that language was Lashon HaKodesh, it was Hebrew. So historically, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, since we know that the whole world spoke Hebrew from time immemorial, from the time of creation, we know therefore that Hashem uses this as the original language. So that's what makes it superior. Now, we're going to learn later on, when we get to the fourth essay, there's a book that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to reference that is an ancient Kabbalistic work. It is probably the oldest work on Jewish mysticism that is known to us, and is called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. The Book of Creation is something that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was very, very familiar with, and he uses it to explain how not only was Hebrew the original spoken language, but God actually used the letters of the Hebrew alphabet to create the universe as we know it. In other words, the letters of the alphabet for us are just non-physical letters, concepts with shapes that we use, and that they have certain phonetic pronunciations that we use to construct words. For God, he actually used those as the building blocks, as the basic ingredients for the construction of our world. And that's why when we look at creation, it says Vayomer Elokim. God said, let there be light, and there was light. It was the usage of God's verbiage, his utterance of the Hebrew language, that gave rise to all that exists. And Sefer Yetzirah is devoted to explaining how the different configurations of the Hebrew letters created all that we know to be reality. That's the whole objective of Sefer Yitzir. The book of creation is, how did God make this world? Yes?
So as you're saying all of this that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying about Hebrew being a historical language, I'm thinking every single word in the Torah can be understood and traced and connected and meaningful. Not just the names, but every single word. And I don't understand why he doesn't just come out and say, because the Hebrew language is divine, it's from God, that's why it's superior.
But he has to prove it. How do we know that it's divine?
You can't really prove anything. And it also bothers me a little. It's the first time that I'm hearing this, and it bothers me. Like, why is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi trying so hard to convince him that of the veracity of Judaism? It's like he's trying so hard to convince. If you learn the Torah and you see how every Hebrew word makes sense and is connected and significant and all ties in together, then you would understand why it's a Lashon HaKodesh and divine. I'm not making sense?
You know, you're making sense, but my question to you is, are you perhaps living in an echo chamber? In other words, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, what I'm asking you is, is your argument so sound and logical to you only because of your conditioning and upbringing? In other words, if you tried to offer that argument to someone who was a non-Jew, who was not raised among our people, and said, just read the Torah in the original Hebrew, and you'll be able, by the way, this is the Islamic argument, why, if you don't study the Quran in Arabic, you have no way of appreciating its divinity. If you remember, that was the way that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had represented the argument of the Qadi, of the Islamic judge, who was represented as putting forth the Islamic argument. The most convincing argument to prove the divinity of the Quran is by reading it. And just by reading it, you'll see its divinity. But I see it, and I don't see its divinity. That's because you don't know Arabic. If only you knew Arabic, you'd be able to see its divinity.
I think the same thing is true about the Torah.
Well, it may be for the initiated.
Right.
In other words, if I'm an initiated Muslim, then I could probably appreciate the esoteric and the inherent beauty and divinity of the Quran. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe. But because I'm already looking at it from a certain orientation that is predisposed towards Islam and towards the Quran. And perhaps you could make that argument with the Torah also. That's the reason why I'm asking you, is this an echo chamber argument? In other words, is it only coming from a person who's already been initiated in Torah from a very early age and therefore appreciates its beauty? That's the reason why I think Rabbi Yehuda Halevi needs to give this historical argument, because he's dealing with someone who's coming from the outside.
If I were not religious, I would say, okay, you're saying that Adam and Chava spoke Hebrew and their names are connected in Hebrew, and I would say, how do you know? You weren't there. We see it because we know the Torah. But if I were, the outsider, I would say, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no.
No, but that's a different argument. That argument is, how do I know that the Bible is true? If he's working under the assumption that the Bible is a legitimate document of history. If you accept the Bible as a legitimate historical document, so then this proves that Hebrew was the spoken word of the time. If you don't, so then we have more to discuss. So there was a lot of foundational work that he brought to the king up to this point to show him that there's a certain plausibility to the document that we call the Torah as being a plausible, legitimate document.
You're saying that the document is from God, not just that it existed.
No, just that it's a historical document at this point. We're going to see later on he's going to provide that this is the divine language also. But for now, the argument is purely from the historical standpoint. That it's Hashem's language also. He's going to bring that in as well, but that's going to be the next part.
See, for me personally, that wouldn't influence me if you tell me Hebrew was the most robust, and Hebrew was the one first spoken, and Hebrew was so beautiful, and this and that. That would all mean nothing to me. It's only because it's from Hashem and it's divine that it means something to me.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think this is part of this is that he's saying that this is the language which God used when he spoke with Adam and Chava.
So that's like saying it's divine?
It's everything is divine, right? Ultimately, isn't everything divine? Even Arabic is divine because Hashem created it, but it's, from our perspective and from our belief, is that all languages were created by God in some way or orchestrated by God. But Hebrew is the language that God spoke first to mankind. So it obviously shows that he has a certain affinity or preference for Hebrew over other languages. The only thing I just added was this whole thing from the Sefer Yetzirah, that it's not just that God has a preference for it, but that it's actually the essential building blocks of reality. But that's not the argument that he's making now.
I just wanted to respond. So, I mean, if you're going to try to explain something to somebody, it's kind of hard to start from our perspective and expect them to believe it. So, I mean, in a way, it's sort of like, first you have to teach them the basic building blocks of it. So if you explain to them, I guess, that the language, explain part of why the language reflects this A, B, C, and D, and then you build on that. Now that you believe that Hebrew is important, then you can continue from there to go on and extend it to saying, well, this is the language that God used, and this is the language that was given in creation. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't just start at the top. And that's how I see it. I see it as part of an extensive explanation, but this is like the starting point, maybe.
I guess my thing is we learn so many things out from the Torah from one letter, how we have to act, what we have to do. If you don't believe that those letters are divine, if it's just Shakespeare, then why would you care to change your life based on those letters?
Right. So a question, again, part of the whole purpose of a book of this nature is to demonstrate the divinity of the Torah. It's to help us better appreciate that the things that we do believe are based on logic, are based on history. That we're not just pulling it out. It's not just a matter of faith that we believe these things. That's really the whole purpose of the Kuzari. Right? Yeah.
I have a situation in my condo building where it says in the Condo Act that you're not allowed to adhere anything to the door or the door frame. So one of the girls, who's also on the board, wanted us to target all the Jewish people and remove the mezuzahs, right? Because that was in the Condo Act. And I was trying to explain to her that that's not going to happen anytime soon. And, the Jewish people have been putting mezuzahs on their door for thousands and thousands of years. But I just couldn't get through to her because she just doesn't understand. And, what was I supposed to say? It's written in the Bible, maybe she doesn't believe in the Old Testament.
Right.
It's very hard to get into a religious argument with people who don't understand it.
Correct. And ultimately, the Kuzari is not written specifically for the non-believer. It's written for the believer. But it's written for a believer who would like to know, show me why what I believe makes sense. That's really what Rabbi... Remember, the context of the Kuzari is he's writing this for his Jewish community, who are practicing Jews to one degree or another, but who are being criticized, whether overtly or covertly, for the apparent primitiveness of their religious ways, which is something that's very contemporary also. So a book of this nature seeks to try and demonstrate, using logic, using history, that there's a certain reasonableness to Judaism and to the Torah and to why we accept the tradition that we have.